Welcome to Law Syrup, the show where we talk with special guests about hot topics in Canadian law. This podcast is a co-production with the Ontario Justice Education Network, also known as OGEN. I'm your host, Herman Wong. Let's tap in. Before we begin, please know that this show is not intended to be legal advice or a replacement for a legal representative. Hey everyone, welcome back to Law Syrup. On today's episode, our guest is Douglas Kwan, the Director of Advocacy and Legal Services for the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario, or ACTO for short. As a renter myself, currently living in Toronto, and also most of my friends, I've always been curious to know more about tenants' rights and what resources are available if a tenant needs help. I actually saw Douglas on my TV one day, and I immediately thought, hey, he'd be a really good guest for the show. So you can imagine my happiness when he said yes when I asked. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Douglas Kwan. So Douglas, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing well, Herman. Thank you for inviting me.
You know, it's great because the reason why I thought of you is I must have been watching either CP24 or The National. And I remember seeing you on my TV and I was like, this guy is so interesting. And we haven't done an episode on tenants' rights. And I thought, you know, as a tenant myself, I would be very interested to hear what you have to say, especially with the state of the rental market here in Ontario. But before we get started, there was a very interesting article on Precedent about yourself and the housing crisis. And the initial few paragraphs talked about how musicians actually influenced your desire to make change. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that, because I found it very interesting.
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. So, as I recall, when I was first interviewed at the Precedent article, they wanted a little history about my background and why I was interested in social justice. And so it really harkened back to when I was a young boy back in the early 80s. What was happening was in Ethiopia was experiencing a once in a generation famine, and a group of musicians that I recognized at the time and got together and fundraised to support people that are they don't know that are thousands of miles away. And that collective action spurred more collective action in the United States and in Canada, and became a massive, massive event where it brought more knowledge across the globe about the plight of people suffering in Ethiopia, and really demonstrate to me the power of collective action. That where if no task is too big when we can work collectively to try and tackle that task and problem. And so it also taught me and redefined community for me. Community can be defined as your household, but it could also include the entire planet. And so it really demonstrated how we're all interconnected, that we can solve big problems together.
Who was singing? Do you remember?
Oh my gosh, it was so
Was there Bruce Springsteen at
Bruce,
that concert?
Bruce, well, yeah, there's a whole bunch of 80s stars, and you hear it every Christmas, and it's gosh, I'm trying to
Do they know it's
do they
Christmas?
know
Wait,
it's Christmas? And then
what
there's
is
the
the name of the
Canadian
song? Yeah,
version.
that
Yeah,
one.
do they know it's Christmas?
Yeah,
That's the UK version. The Canadian version is called "Tears Are Not Enough," and the US version is called "We Are the World." And they were
right.
collectively called Live Aid, and they had concerts at Wembley Stadium and everywhere else. And Madonna was part of it. U2 was part of it. And so that was really the age of just where musicians were more than just the music, and they really believed that they could make a difference.
I know that you've worked previously at the Mississauga Community Legal Services, but what led you to work in poverty law and legal aid work generally?
It didn't come easily at first, and didn't, and certainly when I went to law school, it wasn't top of mind.
Hmm.
As most people think of law school or think of a career in law, they usually think of what they see on television, like criminal law, corporate law. And when I went to law school, I had my eyes set on, one of those traditional areas of law. And then I started at the Student Legal Aid Clinic, and that's when I discovered how impactful my skill set could be to individuals' lives. And that's when I first introduced to legal aid and poverty law.
And for the listeners who don't know, what exactly is legal aid and why is it important to the legal framework of our province?
But legal aid is a program that's born out of a concept that poor people, low-income Canadians, disproportionately suffer more when they're faced with legal challenges. So if you think of, say, a person being fined for trespassing because they're living on a park, they have a tent in a park, they're fined $50, just to say. So people of other income, they can just pay the fine and then that they could just move on. But not so people living in the margins, people living with poverty. And so that fine could be unpaid. Then that could impact their ability to find housing, to find employment. And we're still, that could lead to possible incarceration. And so it's important that people who can't afford a lawyer have access to legal services and understanding their legal rights to avoid those disastrous consequences
Right.
that might result in very, I guess I would describe as, subtle or minor infractions. Yeah, and so poverty law is a sort of legal aid, provides people who have no means to pay for a lawyer with immigration law service, criminal law service, or family law services. And one subset of legal aid's services is the community legal clinic program that provides poverty law services. So you can think of housing law, income maintenance law, employment law, areas of law that ensure that people have a roof over their head or food on the
Hmm.
table. And so poverty law services is what community legal clinics do, and there are approximately 70 community legal clinics across the province to serve low-income Ontarians.
So you were at Mississauga Community Legal Services. You then moved to the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario. Tell us a little bit about what you currently do at the ACTO.
Well, my role as director is really leading the legal work and the advocacy work of the team. It's a team of professionals, and the goal is to advance tenants' rights. And that could be one day through litigation, appearing before the Supreme Court, which we've done twice over the last 4 years. It could mean delegating at the municipal level for introducing anti-rent eviction bylaws. It could mean being invited by elected officials to comment on bills that impact tenants. It could also mean going out into the community. For example, today we're out and we've been invited by a nonprofit to speak to their group about tenants' rights. It could be about organizing tenants to form a tenant association. So those are several areas in which ACTO work towards advancing tenants' rights. And we're a provincial legal clinic, which means that we're aware of what's happening over in Thunder Bay and understanding that what tenants experience in Thunder Bay is different than what they're experiencing in Ottawa or Niagara Falls. So we have a provincial view of tenants' rights. We also have three distinct and great programs that we currently run. One is called the Low Income Energy Network, and you'll see the impact of that in your energy bills, where there are programs that are available for people who fall behind in their bill payments. And there are programs that help support them to make sure that their gas isn't cut off during the winter months. Or the Tenant Duty Council program that provides self-represented tenants who appear at the landlord tenant board with legal advice, or the Your Way Forward program, which is a new program we have that supports survivors of intimate partner violence with their housing needs. That's what ACTO, the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario, does. But there are also smaller clinics like the one I used to work at in Mississauga that provides poverty law services, but for a specific catchment area. So that being the city of Mississauga residents. So really, it's a vast network, the clinic system in Ontario. Ontarians should be very proud of our clinic system and that it's there to help people.
Amazing. Yeah, you mentioned the landlord and tenant board, and I have some more questions for you later on during the episode. But I also want to point out that Acto has some great resources on their website, and we'll post the website link in the description down below. I also want to point out one of the reports that you published in 2023. It was titled Housing Hardship. And when I read through this report, there were a couple of findings that really astonished me. And I just want to read some of those out for the audience. So, one of the findings in the report is that 31.4% of Ontarians rent their homes. Now, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC for short, defines affordable housing as one that does not exceed 30% of one's gross income. However, 1 out of 4 renters pay unaffordable rents. So, Douglas, when you see these numbers, how did we get to this situation where monthly rent seems to get more and more expensive.
Yeah, it's really a policy failure that has gone back over 30 years ago. Since World War II, when our veterans were coming back home from the war, Canada made a conscious effort to ensure that there's housing available for everybody and embarked on a very ambitious program to ensure that there's affordable housing. And so many of the high rises you see in Toronto and elsewhere, those multi-residential buildings were built in the 60s and 70s as part of that growth. And in the 90s, unfortunately, the federal government took a step back and decided not to get involved in housing.
Hmm.
They then delegated and downloaded that responsibility to the provinces. And in Ontario's case, downloaded the responsibility for affordable housing to municipalities. And so as a result, many or almost all of the housing that's been built over the last 3 years has been through the markets, the private market,
Hmm.
which is great to build market or luxury housing, but has proven unable to provide truly affordable housing because governments have stepped away from filling that gap. And so that's why we're in this crisis to begin with. In fact, Ontario is the only province in the country that has downloaded that responsibility of affordable housing to municipalities. And they don't have the funds in order to provide truly affordable housing to people who need it.
Yeah, I had no idea that this was a municipal issue. I always thought that it might have been a provincial one, but
Yeah, no, certainly, and certainly it is a provincial issue. They've just downloaded some of the responsibilities to the municipal level. But at the end of the day, housing is a provincial responsibility when it comes to shelters, transitional housing, affordable housing, and the private market. It's really the responsibility, in this day and age, it's still the province's responsibility. So during the course of that downloading process, provinces have also weakened rent control
mm,
to try and spur the private market to build multi-residential buildings. And what we found is that the of all the buildings that have been created, less than 10% have been purpose-built rental units
mm,
because builders are just more interested in building condos. They build the building and then they take their profit immediately upon the purchase of those condos. It's much more attractive model for investors. And so we have a glut of condos in the market and a lot of small investors who want to ensure that whatever rent is being charged will cover their mortgage and condo fees, which is higher than what, let's just say, a long-term investor who is running a purpose-built rental would want. And so that's why we're seeing unaffordable rents. Also, when you're talking about unaffordable rents, we can't step away from a conversation about not enough income.
right.
People's income has not risen to the same rate as rents in Ontario. And certainly that's true for the social people on social assistance. Actually, in Toronto, I saw a couple months ago, a closet being rented out for $750 a month.
Mm,
And that's only 30 or $40 less than what an adult would be receiving on social assistance.
wow.
I've seen over the last couple of years landlords renting half of a mattress and saying we prefer females to apply for this half a mattress. So it's quite astonishing the just the crisis that we're in. And not to mention, of course, there's the homelessness crisis as well. That's connected to the affordable housing crisis because when you can't afford a place to live in your own community, oftentimes we find people who've been evicted from their local community ending up living in the park nearby while sending their kids to school. So it's quite it's a complex crisis, but one that, with political will and the right policies, we believe can be solved.
You mentioned unaffordability, which appears to be a very big issue. In the report that I mentioned earlier, there's also a mention of a 2022 report by Statistics Canada. And I just want to list some of the numbers. So 58% of Canadians between 15 to 24 years old reported being very concerned about their ability to afford rent. The number for Canadians between 25 and 34 years of age is similar at around 56%. And this issue is not just isolated for young Canadians, as 74% of Black Canadians reported being concerned about rent and 65% of South Asians. So when you see these numbers, what is your reaction when you take a look and you see this type of gap that exists?
It tells me that the rental housing crisis is not being felt equally. Folks who are marginalized, whether that be based on their ethnicity, race, age, gender, sexuality, income, or religion, they experience greater barriers to accessing safe and secure affordable housing. And it's really unjust what we're seeing at the moment. And it's also frustrating because many people can't save enough to purchase a home. That people who are expected, who reach those milestones, whether it be graduating university, getting married, having children, those milestones, you expect them to move on along the housing continuum. They're stuck in where they are because there's just simply not enough affordable housing for them to take that next step.
You know, you hear people mention, the term affordable housing. What does affordable housing actually mean? Is there a specific definition for that?
So the definition that we recognize is 30% of your household income should be no more than 30% of your household income should be dedicated to shelter.
Right.
But what we've been seeing, actually, people are living paycheck to paycheck. They're on the margins, and they're just an above guideline rent increase away, or a legal rent increase away from being evicted.
So not only is rent a big issue, but there are many other issues that tenants might face when they're renting a home. In your experience at ACTO, what are some of the biggest concerns that you hear from renters?
Well, we've seen a dramatic rise over the last 3 years of bad faith evictions. And what that means is that in the current legislative scheme, there are tenant protections from arbitrary evictions. There should be a reason in order to be evicted. But there are methods of evictions that don't require the tenant to act badly or against the law. And those are when a landlord requires a unit for themselves or when they need a vacant unit for renovations purposes. We've seen many investors use those two methods to try and obtain a vacant unit to drive up the rent of that unit. So we call them bad faith evictions. So we've seen probably it grow by 300% over the last 4 years of those types of evictions. We've seen many people falling behind on their rent because their income hasn't been able to catch up to the rate in which rent has increased. Over the last 5 years, rent has gone up by about 17%. And very, very few people have experienced a similar wage increase during that same period of time to meet that rent increase. And we've also seen a growing homelessness crisis where people on social assistance, the number of people who are homeless and on social assistance have doubled from 2022 to 2024. And that's a result of just people simply not being able to find housing that is affordable to them and are left to sleeping in their cars or elsewhere.
So what kind of legal frameworks might exist to help protect tenants? And how can that help regulate what landlords can or cannot do?
Well, the overarching legislation that protects tenants is called the Residential Tenancies Act. It's a quite a complex piece of legislation that determines when tenants can be evicted, what rights they have, what obligations landlords have to maintain a property. So it speaks to security of tenure. There's also the Human Rights Code that ensures that people aren't discriminated against when they're looking for an apartment and when decisions are made. If you are a tenant who's living in social housing, there's a Housing Services Act that determines how rent goes up. So there are major pieces of overarching legislation that do regulate tenancies and protect tenants. But at the end of the day, it's really a complaints-driven process. It's up to the tenant to complain about their rights being infringed. And that's really the challenge because we're talking about people who are already marginalized, whose English or French might not be their first language. So they're unable to understand their rights or communicate or assert their rights. And so that is the problem of a complaints-driven process, but that's what we have in Ontario.
And when complaints are made, they're made to the landlord and tenant board, correct?
Yeah.
We mentioned that earlier on in one of your responses. So what exactly is the landlord and tenant board and what can they help with?
That's a tribunal that hears disputes between landlords and tenants, where landlords and tenants have infringed or breached their obligations under the Residential Tenancies Act. It's a tribunal that's the busiest tribunal in Ontario, typically hearing approximately 80,000 applications for hearings every year. And they are supposed to meet out their disputes in a fair and summary way. However, I believe probably your next question is how are they performing?
Yes.
And I can definitely tell you that over the last 5 years has demonstrated a marked decline in their ability to perform that function. In 2020, we saw how and all tribunals and courts moved to a virtual format because of the pandemic. But many of them have returned to in-person hearings or hybrid hearings, but not so the landlord tenant board. And so what's been happening, and because of that change and emphasis on their digital hearings, we've seen the board become slow in terms of scheduling hearings, in terms of issuing decisions. And as a result, last year, the Ombudsman of Ontario said that tenants had to wait up to 2 years to have their matters heard, whereas landlords only wait 6 to 9 months.
Hmm.
And the primary reason for that delay, as I mentioned, is because they moved to in-person hearings and Zoom formats. So in our conversation today, we're talking to each other through Zoom. And Herman, you're kind enough not to talk over me because we want to have a conversation. We have that common goal of learning from each other. But at the landlord tenant board, two parties are adversarial. They waited months to have their issues addressed.
Right.
And they're not going to be that way. And so the ombudsman acknowledged that these hearings were chaotic. And so you add that to the busiest system in busiest tribunal in the province, and you're going to have slower processing times. So if I wanted to give you an example, think of McDonald's, for example, and they have different methods of access. That's drive-through, that's app, that's in person on the counter. So different methods of getting what you want. So that's what the landlord tenant board had. They had different methods of adjudication. You can mediate matters, you can go there in person, but they went to digital. So imagine McDonald's doing the same thing. They force everyone going to go through the drive-through. You can imagine that drive-through lineup. And they would only allow other alternatives if one were to say, I don't drive because I can't access your drive-through. And so that is the type of backlog that's been created at the landlord tenant board because it's the busiest tribunal, because it's an adversarial system. It can't do as good a job as it was in person because in person, you don't need a Zoom moderator to put people in breakout rooms. People just have conversations on the side. You can have multiple conversations to try and resolve matters. And unfortunately, their ability to resolve matters outside of the adjudication process has gone down from 40% to now 6%. And that's why, and that's primarily because of the format they've chosen.
And I presume so many of these people who go to the landlord and tenant board are self-represented parties. What kind of tools are available for self-represented people to access in order to understand how this entire process works?
There are online tools that the landlord tenant board offers. There are online self-guided pathways that the community legal clinic system has. There's also the legal clinics themselves and tenant duty council. So if anyone had received any documents from the landlord tenant board or had questions about their rights, I would highly encourage them to not wait for their day of their hearing, but to reach out to their community legal clinic. But if they hadn't reached out to their community legal clinic, then there's tenant duty counsel that's available on the day of their hearing for people who had questions, for people who needed advocacy on their dispute. And so tenant duty counsel is a program that the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario runs across the province. And so that's a program that's there to assist.
And Acto also offers a tenant duty council program, if I'm correct.
That's right.
So if I was an aggrieved tenant, what is the number one step that I should do first in order to find some sort of solution?
I would Google Legal Aid Ontario and find out where your local clinic is. So we have community legal clinics across the province. So whether you live in Bracebridge, Rainy River, in Thorold, Ontario, in Ottawa, you name it, there is a community legal clinic that can serve you. Even 5 minutes or 10 minutes of advice is better than searching online, trying to find the answers. Because really, when it comes to residential tenancy law, you won't find a better expert than the people who are working at the local community legal clinic. So that's really the first place that I would go to.
Amazing. And you mentioned online solutions, and part of me was a little curious, and I decided to go online and see what some people are saying about the rental situation. So if you go on the Toronto subreddits, there's some very interesting comments, and people try to help each other out. You have people calling the situation here in Ontario flat out unaffordable. You have people living with multiple roommates, and you have people saying that the best they can do is move to the suburbs. So, out of curiosity, how does Toronto, or to a larger extent, Ontario, how does that rental situation differ from other major cities or areas in the world?
Well, Ontario is the most unaffordable province for renters in Canada, followed by BC. That's in part because we have the highest tenant population here. And so when you look at Stats Can data, of the 20 most unaffordable municipalities in Canada, 12 are in Ontario. And the problems are very similar across all the provinces and territories. There's an affordable housing crisis, certainly, but Ontario experiences the brunt of it because of its sheer population. There's approximately 1.7 million renter households in Ontario. And although there are tenant rights legislation in place, but it's still a complaints-driven process. And we still have large rent control loopholes in Ontario that needs to be closed. When we're talking about affordable rents, we need to get rents under control in order for people to afford in order for people to be able to afford to live in the places that they grew up in the near their workplaces, and for them to feel that they have a place that's safe and secure to live in.
Absolutely. So, speaking about your own personal experience, have you had any personal experience with renting, for example, in Ontario or in Toronto?
I have actually very recently, last year, in fact, I rented a townhouse because my home was had to go under some renovations. And so it was quite a pleasant experience, and by far, I have to say, I would say 80% of landlord-tenant relations are pleasant,
Hmm.
are situations where it never reaches the media or the landlord-tenant board. It's really much like all the other stories you hear. We're talking about the worst 20% or 10% of those stories. So as a tenant, I certainly experienced for that brief period of time what a tenant's like, but I know that my experience is nowhere near, I would say, the atypical tenant experience.
Yeah, as a current renter myself, I think I'm very blessed and privileged to have a good landlord-tenant relationship, and I know that's not the case for a lot of people. And I do see those stories that you mentioned earlier about, people renting out mattresses or closets, and you see these and it's very egregious, but I was wondering, is there any type of change that's coming or that you know about that gives you hope for the future?
Yeah, I have a lot of hope. I want to tell you, there's this new advocacy group called Fair Rent Ontario that's come together to win comprehensive rent control in the province. And so the goal is to reinstate rent control. That means that it'll be an end to vacancy decontrol, which is the method, as I said before, where if you have a vacant unit, a landlord can charge to their heart's desire the rent for the next tenant. And so we want to close that loophole where even if a unit becomes vacant, that rent is moderated.
Mm.
We want to make sure through Fair Rent Ontario that there's no longer a 2018 exemption, which means that any building that's first occupied after 2018 is not rent controlled. So that's why we're seeing situations where people are enticed to move and live in a building for 1 year, only to find themselves with a double-digit rent increase the following year. And so Fair Rent Ontario is a advocacy organization that's come together and will be advocating to close those loopholes. Housing is a human right. We firmly believe that at ACTO. And the government of Ontario and all parties that want to form government need to ensure that everyone has access to safe and affordable housing. That means applying and adopting some of these policies that we're advocating for, which is closing those loopholes. And we want to also end above guideline rent increases. And those are situations in which you see those purpose-built rental buildings where landlords are making cosmetic changes, replacing the balcony, and then are trying to download the cost of those replacements to the tenants, and thereby increasing their rent by double digits. We want to end that because at the end of the day, it's the landlord's obligation to maintain their buildings. I'm also encouraged when I see cities like Hamilton, Toronto, and London, and other municipalities who are tackling the housing crisis head on. They're introducing things like anti-rent eviction bylaws to ensure that their affordable units stay affordable in their community. I'm encouraged by the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. They're responding to the encampment crisis because by identifying that in Ontario we have 80,000 people living homeless. That's the population of Peterborough. So the Association of Municipalities of Ontario are really calling for increased investments to solve the homelessness crisis. It's unfortunate that we have a political party that wants to trample on charter rights as its solution. When really, when we're talking about housing, it's the provincial responsibility and unfortunately the province's failure to address housing, which has led to this crisis. So I'm encouraged to see that municipalities are stepping up and trying to do what the province should be doing more of, which is really investing in housing. Also, through our work, there are many ways that we think that all levels of government can be involved to try and solve the housing crisis. I have a laundry list here with me, and if you're okay listening to it, I
Sure. Yeah,
want
go
to,
ahead.
yeah. So first of all levels of government can be involved in creation of affordable housing. And so I mentioned municipalities, gave you some examples. The federal government has created a national housing strategy in 2018, and they dedicated billions of dollars towards it. But those billions of dollars were in the form of loans for below market housing. And that's not enough because we don't need below market housing, which is 10 to 20% of what average market rent is. We need deeply affordable housing that meets the definition of CMHC. And so more dedicated funds for truly affordable housing is what the federal government can do. The federal government can, through their tax mechanisms, ensure that real estate investment trusts aren't exacerbating the housing crisis. The provinces can close, as I said, rent control loopholes. They can also do things such as make sure that there's stronger controls for short-term rentals. We saw when the pandemic came about in 2020 how when the province stopped all short-term rental operators from operating, the flood of long-term rental units came online. And so if we had stronger shorter-term rental controls, we can bring more of that supply for Ontarians who need housing. We need the landlord tenant board to be fixed. When the sheriff is not operating well, then we have a Wild West, and that's impacting the housing crisis. Also, municipalities can allocate more funding for shelters and transitional housing to support people living homeless and people who are living precariously housed. Those are some of the things that I think municipalities and provinces and the federal government can do. But there's lots of tools. And so just going back to what you asked me, do I have hope? I have tremendous hope. That we have the tools. They've been tested out in different jurisdictions. We just need the political will to get it done.
Thank you so much for going through that list. And what's so interesting is because, you see people who go out and demonstrate, they protest. And it's really inspiring to see people, tenants who are aggrieved. They're not taking this sitting down. They want to make change. And a lot of those changes are some of the items that you've mentioned as well. I'm sure that that must also be inspiring to the work that you do to see people stand up for themselves and ask for, affordable housing and housing that is not something that has to be an ongoing concern. My last question for you before we end things off here is what has been your favorite moment so far working at Acto, and why does that keep you going?
I have lots of great moments. It's difficult to identify just one.
Hmm.
I think when you ask me that question, I think of our senior litigation lawyer winning big at the Ontario Court of Appeal. I think of our community organizer who is able to connect a handful of tenants and inspire them to form a tenant association who are now part of the Fair Rent Ontario campaign. So there's a lot of great moments. We issue the reports for the public, and it's great to have OGEN be interested in the work that we do and have decision makers and the public really get with the help of our reports get a better understanding of the crisis that we're currently in. So at Acto, we want to make sure that we talk to everybody, whether it's, sure, we talk to tenants, we speak with nonprofits, but we also speak with landlords and we also speak with political parties of all types because housing is not a partisan issue. It impacts everybody, and we can all be part of the solution. And so the part of the job I say that keeps me going is these opportunities to reach out to groups such as yourself and your listeners through your podcast and really drive that home the message that through knowledge and collective action, we can make a difference together.
Amazing. And what a great way to end this episode. Douglas, I want to thank you for your time, for being here today. I think everybody learned a lot about the rental situation here in Ontario. Before we end things off, where can the people find you? Are you on social media?
I'm currently on X, and
Okay.
temporarily, I don't know,
Temporarily. Okay.
temporarily on X. So you can find me at Doug Kwan Acto.
Amazing. Well, Douglas, thank you again. And that concludes this episode. Thank you very much. Thank you for tapping into this episode of Law Syrup. On the next episode, I talk to a panel of teachers who all teach law in high school. I ask them what inspires them and what are some of the best responses they've received from students. Law Syrup is produced by me, Herman Wong, and the Ontario Justice Education Network. For more information and for accompanying resources, check out ogen.ca and our show notes. See you next time.